Right, Freeman, I want to ask you, your ideas are very inspiring, very educational, and I would say that they are capable of literally transforming a life. And I want to know, can you name a person who has had a really big impact on you and shaping the ideas that you teach?
Well, there were many, but they're all coming from the same place. You know, start with the Rebbe, and then the great teachers in yeshiva, and some of the older boys in the yeshiva who basically became my mentor when I was a kid. But they were all saying the same thing. They were all teaching the same thing. And the need was to translate it into real English rather than just translate the words. So the answers are all there. I'm not making up any stuff, and I'm not inventing anything. These are old answers, but nobody ever said them in English. And when they're translated formally, it's really not English. It's not communicating. Like, to tell someone that he should put on phylacteries is not any better than saying put on the tefillin. So the conversation really is just Hasidic discussions, but in real life language.
So I know you learned with Yoel Khan, and I'm wondering how did you realize that this problem that the group as a movement moved to America and this need for English was going to be important, when some of these ideas that you learned, such as intimacy, relationship with God, and that God needs from us, started to be right there in front of your eyes, obviously the whole world doesn't react just like, wow. So how have you been able to grow since the beginning with these ideas and push them forward?
It was primarily the experience of teaching at Beis Chana. We started this program in 1970 or 71, and hours and hours and hours of really open, frank discussion with thousands of women from all backgrounds and from all mentalities, and they wanted to know what Hasidus says. Well, I had to say it in English. So from all those discussions and from all those hours, this is how it evolved.
How were you able, at that point, from my understanding of growing up in a religious environment, there's not much interaction for men with women and women with men, and then you go and you're speaking about not just interacting with women, but women from a totally different background. You have this ability to relate to people. How did that start to take form, and were there any challenging experiences in the beginning?
Getting a little personal here. It was the 70s, and I think that by divine plan, this had to happen in the 70s. The 60s was too crazy. The 70s was just crazy enough for this to happen, because people were still so raw emotionally, so open, and so ready to learn something new and to hear something new. I don't think it could have happened in the 80s, because the 80s was too normal, the 60s was too crazy. I think the 70s was just like perfect. So the discussions were real, they were honest, they were no holds barred, and that forced me to talk, like down to earth. Say something, don't just quote, don't just repeat. So it was a very deep, heart-wrenching kinds of conversations We were talking about the disintegration of life. Families had fallen apart. We didn't even know what families meant anymore. People weren't sure that marriage was even a good idea anymore. So there were these very fundamental issues that were painfully experienced by such a variety of women, who of course are much better at opening up their emotions and so on. So we ended up having discussions that were life-changing. And to a great degree it continues, if you can get past the resistances.
What were some of the earliest conversations you felt or I guess you could say, what were some of the common themes of women that were coming from all over to learn from you?
Well, it was rather obvious that each session, we had 2 sessions a year back then, winter break and summer break. It was obvious that each season brought a new issue in terms of philosophy, politics, and so on. One season it was Eastern religion, another season it was the war in Vietnam, and another season it was eating healthy macrobiotic foods. So every season had its fad, but there was one subject that was consistently hot, and that was family. Parents, children, marriage, relationships. Family was always hot. And so that got a lot of attention, and we dug very deep on that one. And I certainly wasn't trained as a marriage counselor or as a psychologist, so it all had to come from the Hasidus that I learned in yeshiva. And all of a sudden it had to be relevant to a wide variety of people. So we had to get to the core of the subject or it wouldn't work.
How have you managed that from then to now to read something in a text that's one language with and it's not just a language or a text, they really mean real things, bring them over to another language and make it relevant to these issues that people are coming to you with?
Well, if you start with the assumption that when you're reading a text in the Torah, it's basically a personal testimony of a devotion or of a need or of a relationship that God has with His world, the purpose that He created the world for in the first place. In other words, if you just try to take it all very personal, someone is talking to you, it happens to be God, but He's talking to you, and He's trying to tell you something. And if you listen, you realize that you're hearing a lot more than just do this or do that. And then it translates very naturally into human relations.
What do you do to on a consistent basis to ensure that you're able to reach that level of understanding and approach the Torah in that way?
I'm not sure I do anything, I just love it. If I don't see that, I don't enjoy the learning. So if you don't get that personal message, if you don't realize that you're being spoken to and you're being addressed and you're being told something personal, it doesn't feel like you're learning. It's like just reciting.
Would you say that might be one of the bigger differences in how we approach education versus how, let's say, how I was raised in American education?
Without a doubt. But you can study Torah that way too, without feeling any personal, hearing anything personal. So let me ask you a simple question, just as an example. What do you think would be a more appropriate description of the Torah? The Torah could be the diary of the Jewish people. That's basically what it is. We went here, we went there, we did this. our ancestors did that and we ended up here. Right? Diary of the Jewish people. Or is it really God's personal diary? Is this not God saying, today I had a good day because Avraham, I like him. Or this week was miserable. It rained for, this month was miserable. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights because I was wiping everybody out. So is it not his personal diary? So shouldn't every word in the Torah be heard as God trying to get close, trying to be personal, trying to reveal something of himself? And is that not the ideal relationship pattern? So how can you miss it? I mean, once you see it, you can't miss it anymore.
So it became something like that every time you approach it, you realize that that's what you're going for. And if it's learning, like just learning a business book, it's just not going to be fulfilling for you.
And I think that learning the style rather than the content from Biel Khan or other teachers, just how to approach the text. So I don't remember Rabbi Yael talking about marriage and relationships and intimacy in this language at all, but that's how he studied. That's what he heard. So I guess I picked up his style, not his content.
Gotcha. A question that I'm excited to ask you is, from being in person classes to this moment to just listening, you seem to always manage to stay calm, and you're asked questions that can aggravate anybody or irritate or get them excited. Was it ever a challenge for you to stay calm?
What? I don't know. Just lucky.
It's always been there?
Yeah.
I think it's an important thing in your role. I don't think there could be any other way to do it.
Well, I guess you have to trust the student, the questioner, that they really want to know, and they're asking a legitimate question. You also have to trust your information, your subject. So if you know your subject and people are challenging it, it's pleasurable, it's enjoyable. And if you trust the questioner, up to a point, then there's nothing to get upset about.
Can you explain what Hasidus is?
What is Hasidus? Number one, primarily, Hasidus is Torah. And Torah is a revelation that began at Mount Sinai. So that is the first important fundamental definition. It's Torah. It's like the 5 books of Moshe, and it's like the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Kabbalah, and then there's Hasidus. It's that part of Torah. What's different about it is that it goes to the soul of every subject. Not much is said in the other parts of Torah about why God created the world. We know what we're supposed to be doing. We know what He expects of us because that's everywhere in Torah. But why really did He create the world? Which means, what's in it for Him? What is His investment? What is His interest? That's the soul of creation. And in every subject, in every law, in every story of the Torah, there's the soul of the matter, and Hasidus reveals the soul of every topic, of every word in the Torah. So you might say that it is the 5th dimension of Torah. And the 5th dimension is kind of heavenly on the one hand, like beyond the four dimensions of creation, and yet it is the soul of all of creation. So it's kind of a combination of the highest of the high and the lowest of the low, because in the soul of the matter, you cover everything. I don't know if that's a good answer, but sounds good.
Is that why you'll read a speech from the Rebbe talking about, let's say, for example, a good physical example that I like is the Ari Miklat, which is the signs for the cities of refuge, and how he's able to say that, well, everything on a physical level has a spiritual representation, and really spiritually this means that we should be there for another person to guide them on the way.
That's a very good example. The Torah says, put up a sign with an arrow. And the Rebbe says, you are the sign and you are the arrow. And that means you instruct people, you point them in the right direction without drawing any attention to yourself. I mean, if you think about it, what does an arrow, a printed arrow, do? It moves your eye away from itself to something else. So there's a certain humility there, a certain transparency, where you don't draw attention to yourself and you make the issue the central important. So you're pointing the right direction without getting yourself in the way. So how do you find that in a simple statement? Make a sign. Draw a sign to direct people. So yeah, it's a very good example of how there's a soul to every detail, to every matter, and Hasidus finds it, reveals it.
So why is the Rebbe able to do that, but somebody else can't?
Because he's a sign. That's exactly a really great holy person makes you aware of what's important and does not draw attention to himself. So a person who would come to the Rebbe for $1 and they would spend 3 seconds, and the Rebbe would simply say, you should have good news, you should have success, and the person walks away thinking, I really should be a better Jew. I should keep kosher. I should not work on Shabbos. Now, where did that come from? Nobody said anything about Shabbos. Nobody said anything about kosher, or even about being Jewish. And yet, the Rebbe, like the sign, drew his attention to what's important and not to himself.
And he did that, you're saying, not by talking, but by the opposite, in a way.
By his being.
So sounds like a pretty huge lesson in influencing somebody else right there. It sounds like you're saying that by people coming to him and by him being himself, that affected more of a change than saying, hey, you should keep Shabbat.
Yeah, and the Rebbe actually believed that we could all do that.
Well, how can I do that if I didn't grow up religious and I just went to Mino for 2 years and now I'm in Pittsburgh?
I think you're better equipped than most. You know the truth and you don't put yourself up as an authority on the subject, so that what comes across is simply the facts without the ego.
There's a very important video called Judaism is Not a Religion, and people who may be inspired that are in my life, who like what I'm doing, they see, wow, you're getting married, you're having kids, you're not struggling financially, but they don't want to become religious. What should someone who loves the ideas but might not want to just take on Shabbat or start keeping kosher do?
Well, but that's like saying, what if somebody wants to get married but doesn't want to have to chip in and do some of the work, or you can't really do that. The religious part, the religiosity, that's something that is totally unnecessary and probably better off without. But the service is essential. And without the service, what does the relationship consist of? So good intentions are very nice and important, but certainly not enough. So a person should begin practicing one mitzvah at a time, whichever mitzvah feels most reasonable, without the intentions of becoming, taking on a religious identity. You're a Jew doing Jewish things. You don't need a religious persona.
And when my non-Jewish friends hear this, and they ask me, well, if you guys got all of these things that you can do, and you have this piece of inside of you called a godly soul, and I don't have that, what does that mean for me? What would you tell them?
It's just a difference of where you're starting and where you're headed for. If you start with a godly soul, you're starting off with godliness and trying to apply it to your life, which is human and physical and mundane and so on and so forth. If you're without the godly soul, you're starting off from the physical, from the mundane, and you're trying to elevate yourself to something more divine, something more holy. So we're coming at it from different directions, but the goal is the same: a godly world.
So you're saying that just because you're not Jewish doesn't mean you're not here to contribute to making this world a place for God?
Profound. Yes.
Amazing. So someone who has gone through a certain period in their life, whether it be the first 15, 30, 45, or even 60 years, and has experienced hardships, whether that might have been parents being lost or people suffering from divorce, child loss, anything, and they say, well, who is God to me?
We sometimes are overwhelmed by our problems, and that's all we see. A person who went through such difficulties and is still functional and is still asking good questions like, what is God to me? Have to thank God for that. So something gave them the strength to continue to be productive or somewhat productive, and even to remain moral and sensitive to where they're asking such a really valid question. When they say, what is God to me? They're in effect saying, so what does he want from me? Why am I going through this? So God is very relevant. They're just not asking it in the most articulate way. But God is very real to them. God has been there all along. And once you put Judaism in the context of a relationship, it becomes very clear, becomes very practical. You haven't really served God for 60 years. Are you going to start now? You haven't been religious for 60 years. You're going to become religious now? Well, of course not. But if you're thinking, God needs something from me for which he created me, and I haven't done much of that for 60 years, so what conclusion do you come to? Well, then do it now. So it makes the idea of forgiveness, repenting, starting new, it makes it so practical. If you haven't done anything for God in the last week or two, well, maybe now is the time. Rather than, well, if I haven't been religious all this time, how am I going to become religious now? You're not becoming religious. It's like you have 5 minutes, a little free time, so can you do something for God? And if you haven't done it all your life, well, then all the more so. So do it now. Which is also why God is so forgiving. Because he still needs what he needs from you, and if you can do it now, well, then that's what counts. What happened in the past, that's sad, but that's not the point. That's not the point. The point is, at any point, at any time, at any stage in your life, there is something you can do for God. Well, why wouldn't you do it?
Well, if he's so great, he created the world and everything that goes into it, what could he possibly need from me?
You see, that's doing his thinking for him. And we're trying to create a God in our image. What do you imagine he might need? Well, that's not a good relationship. If a husband does that to his wife, they're going to be, they're not going to be a happy couple. So we don't really need to do his thinking. If he says he needs something, well, that's all I want to know. How does he get to need that? I don't know if that's a valid question. That's actually insulting. Well, why would you need that?
So that's essentially what is happening when somebody says, why would you say God needs? You're saying that they're essentially invading his space in a way and not respecting that he might want and need something.
And limiting him, surprisingly. Everybody thinks that they're complimenting God by saying he doesn't need anything. But you're actually limiting him. You're assuming that he's human, and just like you can't be bothered with little things and wish you weren't bothered by anything because you have limited energy, so you assume that God is the same way and that he can't be bothered. But he's God. He's not human. So why are we trying to limit him by saying he can't need, he can't enjoy, he can't want, he can't feel? Of course he can. He's God.
I can't help but wonder if part of that comes from the physical manifestation of leaders that we have, and that so much of being a powerful leader, like Trump and Hillary going against each other, and it's all about me and I'm strong. Maybe we see so much, and actors and all these people have to be so perfect that maybe we start building in our head that God is this thing above us and can't possibly be vulnerable enough to need something from little old us.
Well, one of the big discoveries in the 20th century, psychology, is that vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness. Well, if it's a strength, then he certainly has that. And that's what makes God lovable. We're supposed to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our might. Well, if he's indifferent, he doesn't need us, and he's not affected by us, and he's not vulnerable, how do you love someone like that? What makes him lovable is the fact that he's infinitely vulnerable. And we should learn to be that way too, to imitate him.
On the subject of intimacy, something that I get asked a lot is, why did I, as a Jew, who grew a relationship to God, why do I believe and why did I go about my life in a way where I did not have sex before marriage, and that I believe the only way to achieve intimacy is through marriage?
Why is the only way to achieve intimacy through marriage?
And that why there's no intimacy before marriage? Why are we saying that you can't have sex before you get married?
Well, first of all, I'm not saying that you can't, because obviously you can. The point is that if we take the intimacy out of sexuality and we're left with just sex, then we're destroying ourselves. It's damaging ourselves. We're supposed to be in the healthy frame of mind. We're supposed to be purposeful creatures. We're supposed to be serious about our relationships. And relationships need a little more respect than we're giving it. And just sex is really an abuse of what should have been a relationship. So when you're acting intimate without being intimate, that is a terrible habit to get into. It's like the habit of lying, or the habit of boasting about things that aren't true. It's really a bad, bad habit. And then you get married and you don't know how to stop that habit, and you think you're just continuing to have a permanent partner for sex. That's really not what it is at all. So the ideal is that if you're going to be intimate, then do it for real. If you're going to tell me what happened, tell me the truth. Be real. If you're going to describe yourself, don't exaggerate your faults, don't exaggerate your talents. Be real. And real closeness or real intimacy only happens in marriage. Although emotionally it can happen outside of marriage, where two people really bond on a certain soul level, well then they're effectively married. And if they separate, they will go through the same trauma as any divorce. Which is another reason not to play with it. Because you may not intend to get that committed or that attached. And yet, if you act intimate, you might become that attached. And then you're neither here nor there. So you pay the price as if you're married, you don't get any of the benefits of being married. So it's just a bad risk to play around with something so powerful and so good, and to treat it like a casual entertainment. What is it called? What is that free sex called? Recreational sex. There is no. Somebody wrote a book, something about, what do you mean safe sex? If it's safe, it's not sex. If it's not powerful, if it can't make you bond with another person permanently, then it's not even sex. It's just acrobatics.
So you're saying if you're involved in that type of activity before you're married, you're essentially married and get married already. Because otherwise, you're in a way feeding a bomb that's between the two of you that you haven't removed yet.
Or if there is no bond, then you're just degrading yourself and your partner. So if it's real, then it should be in marriage. If it's not real, why are you doing it? Don't use another person for your entertainment. It's disrespectful, it's degrading, and eventually it'll end up being abusive.
Does it have negative effects in other areas of our life as well?
I think every passion, every appetite has its healthy function and then its misuse or misapplication. If we eat like gluttons, we're probably going to behave sexually like gluttons. If we have a passion or a desire for fame, we're either going to be able to handle it properly and constructively, or it's going to consume us like any other appetite that's out of control. So yeah, it's a measure of being a mensch. Are you in control, or are you the victim of your whims and appetites? So the way we learn to eat will have a big effect on how we're going to behave sexually.
Sounds like in a way you are the person going and doing all these different activities.
Yes. And either you're a mensch or you're not.
Right. On the subject of the Torah being God's diary or the Jewish people's diary, I just was wondering, kind of hit me, if it is God's diary, why is it all about the Jewish people?
Well, that's exactly what God is trying to reveal to us in his diary. Like, what do you find out when you read somebody's diary?
Very personal stuff.
And their deepest passion. So what God is telling us is, I'm obsessed with you. You make me crazy. I love you, I hate you, I need you. I'm obsessed with you. See, we would never know that just by reading the Ten Commandments. It sounds so impersonal. But when you read between the lines, when God says, I am God, your God, what are you hearing?
It's hearing that we're pretty close.
Well, you could take it as, I'm the boss here, I am God, your God. or it's simply an introduction. You don't know me, but I happen to be God. Or it's saying, I am God, infinite, eternal, and perfect, but I want to be yours. I am God, but I want to be your God. That's the soul of the matter. Now you're really hearing him. And then your response is completely different. If it's I'm the boss here, then what's your response?
Yes, sir.
Right. What do you want? What do you want? But if he's saying, I want to be yours, you got to come up with a better response. If you have any romance in your heart.
But it sounds like, if I'm making any assumptions here, that the same principles that go into your marriage are very similar to the relationship we have with God.
Similar. It doesn't have the same awe. It doesn't have the same eternal cosmic power, but the principles are the same. Yeah.
Where are they different as well?
And I guess marriage is a miniature representation of the whole drama of creation and of God wanting a relationship with his people, with his creation. And maybe that's why getting married is like imitating God.
In the terms of turning into a mini creator.
Yeah, being perfect yourself, but not being content with your own perfection.
Huh. Wow.
So we don't get married out of weakness. We get married because no matter how smart we are, how successful we are, and how rich we are, we don't want to do this alone.
Why is that our nature? I can understand with God why that would make sense, but why is that our nature?
Whoa.
As
We've come a long way if you can understand it with God. I think we get it from him. Since we're created in his image, we have that same primal instinct. Alone, to be the only thing that exists is not acceptable.
See, it's evidenced by the fact that he created the world.
Yes.
He can't be alone. And if we're created in his image, neither can we.
And he can't be alone, not out of weakness, out of perfection.
How does that make him perfect?
He has everything, and on top of that, he needs to give everything a purpose, a content.
If the ultimate purpose, as we've learned and we live by every day, is to bring about the messianic time and to bring God back home just the same way he was, but even greater, what at this point are we waiting for to happen, and how can we close the deal, as one might say?
Well, there I think we're getting to the main issue in the world today. The ability to get along, which we seem to have completely lost. The ability to bond, to merge with another person. Every relationship in the world is being challenged. Whether it's political, whether it's between nations, between religions, between philosophies, even between genders. So we have race problems, we have gender problems, we have marriage problems, we have border problems. We just can't seem to get along and to bond properly. And that happens to be the ultimate purpose of all of creation. So we're getting down to the most basic primal quality, and we need to get it right. So what is the purpose of creation? What is it that God is after? our relationship. So what is he waiting for? What's still missing? We haven't gotten to the point where we're ready to really bond. Not with each other, not with our governments, not with our teachers, not with our communities, and not with him. So a unilateral relationship is ridiculous. So no matter how perfect God is, he's completely vulnerable to our response. When we're ready, it can happen. If we're not willing and we're not ready, it can't happen. It can't happen. Which means he can't make it happen. Which makes him vulnerable. He desperately wants something, and yet he has to wait till we're ready. So we got to get ready to be able to respond properly to his proposal. He says, I want to be yours. Well, we got to say that we want to be his. There's no other way. So talking about relationships and getting comfortable with relationships and understanding how it is not a weakness but a strength, this is like getting to the core of everything, because we're there now. We're down to the heart of the issue.
So you're saying that everything up until now has been done, and at this point there's a unity that the world needs to create in order to make God feel comfortable coming back into it.
It's like we've been courting for 5,000 years. We've been engaged for 2,000 years. Isn't it time we got married?
So why does he need to see that if he can kind of bring on whatever period of time he wants to create? Why does he need to wait instead of just doing it now and ending those challenges and problems?
Well, that would be like a mail order bride. He's going to buy us, and he's ready, so the marriage goes on. No, it's got to be coming from us, as real, as genuine, and as true as his. As true as his desire for us, our desire has to be true for him. Coming from us, and he can't play with it. He can't interfere with that. The choice is completely ours. Otherwise, it's not a relationship.
So the key is a relationship, and you mentioned governments, races, nations, and if I'm or someone else is just a person and they can't send a message to Donald Trump or Hillary to quit it, or they can't stop the, as you mentioned, nations' problems or racial problems, and we just live these smaller lives, what can the individual do?
Start with your own family. Start with the immediate relationships that you're in but not paying attention to. Make them good. Make them real. And that'll spread.